Some stories don't begin with grand declarations or sweeping romances. They begin with dust on a window, a letter read too many times, and the quiet terror of stepping toward a life you chose but cannot imagine. This is a story for those who have ever felt they were not quite enough, not pretty enough, not polished enough, not whatever enough the world seemed to demand. It is for folks who have learned that the truest gifts often come wrapped in plain brown paper. Nettie's journey westward was not about finding love. It was about finding out whether honesty could be enough when beauty had never been an option. Perhaps you will recognize something of yourself in her worn calico dress and work-roughened hands. Perhaps you will not. Either way, I hope you will sit a spell and stay a while. The stagecoach hit another rut, and Nettie Groves' teeth clacked together hard enough to taste copper. She pressed her palm flat against the cracked leather seat, steadying herself as the contraption lurched sideways. The wood and iron groaned like an old man's bones on a cold morning. Across from her, a woman in lavender silk clutched a hat box to her chest like a child holding a favorite doll. The woman's gloves were spotless, white kid leather. Not a stain, not a tear, not a single thread loose at the seams. Nettie looked down at her own hands. The calluses had yellowed where they had thickened. Her nails were trimmed short and uneven, done herself with her mother's old scissors 3 days ago in a boarding house room that smelled of mildew and boiled cabbage. There was still a faint bruise on her right thumb from where she had caught it in the laundry wringer last month at the mill in Lowell. Hands like these did not belong in white gloves. She tucked them beneath the folds of her brown calico skirt and turned toward the window. The glass was so thick with dust that Wyoming looked faded and brown, like everything had been left out in the sun too long. Nothing but browns and yellows and the occasional smudge of sage green bleeding through the grime. Lord, give me strength, she prayed silently. 3 more hours, maybe 4. The letter was in her pocket. She did not need to read it again. She had memorized every word during the 3-week journey from Massachusetts, had traced the angular handwriting with her fingertip until the paper grew soft and thin at the creases. I need a woman who can work. I do not need anything else. Josiah Pettit, a rancher in Bitter Creek, Wyoming, 34 years old, widowed twice. According to the marriage broker's notes, though the broker had been careful not to elaborate on how or why those marriages had ended, some questions apparently were not worth asking when a man owned 40 acres and 100 head of cattle. Nettie had asked anyway. The broker, a pinched woman named Mrs. Abernathy, who operated out of a cramped office above a milliner's shop in Boston, had pursed her lips and shuffled her papers. Mr. Pettit is a private man, she had said. He does not share personal matters with strangers. I will not be a stranger, Nettie had pointed out. I will be his wife. Mrs. Abernathy had looked at her then. Really looked. Her gaze traveling from Nettie's faded bonnet to her sensible boots with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock at auction. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, though not in a flattering way. You will do, she had said, and slid the contract across the desk. The memory made Nettie's stomach tighten. She shifted on the hard seat and felt the letter crinkle against her hip. You will do. Not you are perfect, or you are exactly what he is looking for, or even you seem like a sensible match. Just you will do. Like she was a replacement part for a broken machine. Functional, adequate, nothing more. Well, that was fair, was it not? Nettie had not applied to be anyone's dream. She had applied because the factory in Lowell had closed, because her mother's medical bills had eaten through every penny of savings, because the only other option was the workhouse, or worse. She had applied because Josiah Pettit wanted a woman who could work, and Nettie could work. That was the one thing she had always been able to do. The woman in lavender silk was watching her. Nettie pretended not to notice. She kept her gaze fixed on the dusty window, on the endless stretch of prairie rolling past like a brown wool blanket spread across the earth. But she could feel those eyes, curious, pitying, faintly superior, cataloging every detail of her appearance. The dress was clean but old, washed so many times the fabric had grown thin at the elbows. The bonnet was practical, not fashionable, made of sturdy cotton, rather than the delicate straws and silks that grace the heads of proper ladies. And her face. Nettie's hand moved involuntarily toward her cheek, then stopped. She knew what was there. She had known since she was 7 years old, and Billy Patterson had pointed at her across the schoolyard and shouted "Freckleface" loud enough for everyone to hear. The spots had only multiplied since then, spreading across her nose and cheeks and forehead like a map of some country no one wanted to visit. Her mother had tried everything: lemon juice, buttermilk compresses, a foul-smelling paste made from horseradish that had left Nettie's skin raw and burning for days. Nothing worked. Some faces are meant to be noticed for other reasons, her mother had said once near the end, when the consumption had stolen most of her breath but none of her gentleness. Yours is an honest face, Nettie. That is worth more than pretty. Nettie had nodded and smiled and pretended to believe it. But she had been 23 then, and she was 26 now, and no one in 3 years had given her any reason to think her mother was right. Lord, let him be kind, she prayed. I do not ask for love, just kindness. The stagecoach shuddered to a stop. Nettie's heart lurched sideways in her chest. She gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles whitening, as the driver's voice filtered down from above. Bitter Creek. 20 minutes for those continuing on. 20 minutes. Not a final destination for everyone, just a brief pause, a chance to stretch legs before the coach continued its journey to wherever civilized people actually wanted to go. But for Nettie, this was it. End of the line. She gathered her single carpet bag. The handles were fraying, she noticed. Another thing she would need to mend when she found a moment. She waited for the other passengers to disembark first. The lavender woman swept past without a glance, her silk skirts rustling importantly. A man in a bowler hat followed, then a young couple who had spent most of the journey making eyes at each other over their respective books. Nettie was last. She climbed down from the coach carefully, one hand gripping the iron rail, and felt the ground solid beneath her feet for the first time in hours. Her legs wobbled. Her back ached. Her mouth tasted of dust and old coffee. But she was here. Bitter Creek, Wyoming. She looked around. The town, if it could be called that, consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings arranged along a single dirt street. A general store with a faded sign. A blacksmith shop, judging by the ring of hammer on iron drifting from somewhere behind the main structure. A small church with a crooked steeple, its whitewash peeling in the relentless sun. And scattered among them, a handful of houses, and what might have been a saloon. That was all. No grand hotels, no bustling marketplaces, no tree-lined avenues filled with carriages and well-dressed pedestrians. Just wood and dust, and a sky bigger and bluer than any sky Nettie had ever seen, stretching from horizon to horizon like the good Lord had used up all his paint on this one corner of the world. An old man sat on a bench outside the general store, whittling a piece of wood with a dull knife. He looked up as Nettie stepped down from the coach, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat. He leaned toward the man sitting beside him and said something Nettie could not quite hear. But she caught the tail end of it, the words drifting across the dusty street like tumbleweeds. Another lamb to the slaughter. The second man chuckled and shook his head. Nettie's spine straightened. She adjusted the carpet bag in her grip and lifted her chin. Let them talk. She had survived worse than the opinions of old men with nothing better to do than whittle and gossip. You Nettie? The voice came from her left, low and flat as a Kansas prairie. Nettie turned. He was standing beside a wagon hitched to a pair of tired-looking horses. A tall man, broad across the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same brown rock that dotted the prairie. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, the sun-weathered skin, the way he held himself very still. Like a man who had learned that movement attracted attention he did not want. This was him. It had to be. Josiah Pettit. Nettie swallowed. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Yes, she managed. I am Nettie. He did not move, did not smile, did not offer his hand or tip his hat or do any of the dozen small courtesies that a man was supposed to extend when meeting his future wife for the first time. He just looked at her. And in that long, silent moment, Nettie felt every inadequacy she had ever possessed rise to the surface like cream separating from milk. The freckles, the calloused hands, the worn dress and practical bonnet and complete, utter lack of anything that might be called feminine charm. She opened her mouth. I am not pretty, she heard herself say. The words came out thin, almost whispered, like a confession dragged from a guilty conscience. I know the photograph Mrs. Abernathy sent did not show my face clearly, and I should have told you before, but I thought maybe if I just came, if you could see that I can work, that I am strong and I am honest and I... She stopped. Josiah Pettit had turned away from her. For one horrible, plummeting moment, Nettie thought he was leaving, thought he had taken one look at her freckled face and decided that no amount of hard work could compensate for a woman who looked like she had been splattered with mud as a child and never quite washed clean. But he was not leaving. He was reaching into the wagon. When he turned back, he was holding a tin cup, battered, dented, with a chip missing from the rim and a faint stain of rust creeping up one side. He held it out toward her, and Nettie saw the steam rising from its contents. Coffee. Hot and dark and strong. She stared at it. Long ride, Josiah said. His voice was still flat, but there was something in it now that had not been there before. Something that might have been patience or understanding. She could not rightly tell. You must be thirsty. Nettie took the cup. Her fingers brushed against his. Rough calluses meeting rough calluses. Working hands recognizing their own kind. And she felt something shift in her chest. A loosening, maybe. Or a tightening. She could not decide which. Thank you, she whispered. Josiah nodded. He was already turning toward the wagon, reaching for her carpet bag with hands that moved with the efficient economy of a man who never wasted motion. Drink it while it is hot, he said over his shoulder. Coffee is no good cold. Nettie lifted the cup to her lips. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter as regret, and hotter than anything had a right to be in this heat. But she drank it anyway, standing there in the dust of Bitter Creek with her carpet bag being loaded into a stranger's wagon, and tried to understand what had just happened. She had told him she was not pretty. He had given her coffee. It was not an answer. It was not anything she could point to and say, "See, it is going to be all right." But it was not rejection either. It was not the dismissal she had spent 3 weeks preparing herself for. He had given her coffee. She finished the last bitter swallow and looked up to find him watching her. Still no expression on that weathered face. Still no hint of what he might be thinking. But he was watching, and he had not looked away. And when she handed the empty cup back to him, their fingers brushed again. "Ready?" he asked. Nettie thought about the life she was leaving behind. The cramped boarding house rooms. The factory floors slick with oil. The endless gray sameness of days that blurred together like watercolors left out in the rain. She thought about her mother's grave, still unmarked, because there had not been money for a proper stone. She thought about the letter in her pocket, read so many times the words had worn themselves into her memory. "I need a woman who can work." "Yes," she said, "I am ready." The wagon seat was hard, the leather cracked and sun-bleached. The horses were slow, their hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with each plodding step. And Josiah Pettit did not speak a single word as they left Bitter Creek behind and headed out into the endless, terrifying, beautiful prairie. But Nettie was still holding the tin cup. She held it all the way home. The farmhouse emerged from the prairie like a wound. Nettie saw it first as a dark smudge against the orange sky, small, solitary, hunched low to the ground as if bracing against winds that had not yet arrived. As the wagon drew closer, details sharpened into focus. Weathered boards gone gray with age, a roof that sagged slightly on one side, windows like empty eye sockets catching the last light of day and throwing it back without warmth. Josiah pulled the wagon to a stop beside a water trough. The trough was empty, bone dry. Nettie climbed down before he could offer help. Her boots hit the ground, raising a small cloud of dust that settled on the hem of her dress. The porch held a single rocking chair. She stared at it. One chair. Worn smooth on the armrests, the wood darkened where hands had gripped it night after night, year after year. A ghost of movement seemed to cling to it. The memory of someone sitting alone, watching the sun sink below the horizon with no one to share the silence. "Kitchen is through there." Josiah's voice came from behind her. He was lifting her carpet bag from the wagon. "Bedroom is in the back. Outhouse is around the side." He walked past her onto the porch, boots heavy on the boards. Nettie followed him inside. The air tasted stale and close. Dust motes drifted in the dying light from the windows, suspended like tiny ghosts. She saw a cast iron stove crusted with old grease, smelling faintly of bacon fat gone rancid. A table with 2 chairs, though one was pushed against the wall as if it had not been used in years. Shelves holding tin plates, a coffee pot, a single frying pan. No curtains, no flowers, no photographs on the walls, no embroidered samplers, no dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Not a single trace that any woman had ever lived in this house, as if someone had taken great care to erase every sign, every memory, every proof that this place had once held something softer than silence and dust. And there on a shelf in the corner, a Bible. Dust lay thick on its cover. Had not been touched in a long while, Nettie reckoned. Nothing soft here, nothing alive. "Water has been low," Josiah said. He was at the stove now, striking a match. The flame caught, throwing dancing shadows across his face. The smell of sulfur stung Nettie's nose. "Well has been dry 2 years. I haul what we need from town." 2 years. Nettie absorbed this. 2 years of hauling water, of watching the land crack and split, of sitting alone on that single porch chair while the world turned brown and brittle around him. The garden, she started. Out back. Did you used to? Used to. He did not look at her. Not anymore. Nettie moved to the window. Through the grimy glass, she could see what might once have been garden plots. Raised beds now filled with nothing but dust and a few skeletal weeds that had given up the fight long ago. Her fingers pressed against the sill. The wood was rough, unpolished, thirsty for the oil it had never received. How long since anyone had cared for this place? How long since it had felt like a home instead of just shelter from the wind? Your room is through there. Josiah nodded toward a narrow doorway covered by a faded curtain, its flower pattern bleached almost white by years of sun. I will sleep in the barn. Nettie turned to face him. You do not have to. I will sleep in the barn. His voice left no room for argument. He was already moving toward the door, his hat pulled low, his shoulders set in that rigid line she was beginning to recognize as his way of holding himself together. Mr. Pettit. He stopped. Did not turn. The garden, Nettie said quietly. The one that used to be there. What did you grow? Silence stretched between them like a held breath. The stove crackled. Outside, one of the horses stamped its hoof against the hard ground, and somewhere far off, a coyote began its evening song, lonesome and searching. Everything, Josiah said finally. His voice had changed, gone rough at the edges like cloth rubbed too many times against a washboard. My wife. My first wife. She grew everything. The door closed behind him. Nettie stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by dust and shadows, and the ghost of a woman who had grown everything in soil that now grew nothing at all. She looked at the chair pushed against the wall, at the Bible gathering dust on its shelf, at the empty spaces where photographs should have hung, where curtains should have softened the windows, where the small ordinary evidence of a woman's presence should have been scattered throughout every room. But there was nothing, not just neglected or faded, removed deliberately, completely, as if someone had gone through this house room by room and stripped away every trace of every woman who had ever crossed its threshold, as if the very memory of them was too painful to bear or too dangerous to keep. Nettie set the tin cup on the table beside the cold stove. She looked at the faded curtain covering the bedroom doorway, at the single chair at the table, at the emptiness that pressed in from every corner like something with weight and intention, and she wondered what had happened to the second wife. What had she found in this house that made her leave without a word, without a goodbye, without so much as a note pinned to the kitchen table? What secret was this place still holding in its weathered walls and dusty corners? The coyote called again, closer now, its voice rising and falling in the darkness like a question that had no answer. Nettie pulled the faded curtain aside and stepped into the small bedroom. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a wooden trunk at its foot, a window looking out toward the barn where a faint light glowed, golden and solitary, against the gathering night. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the silence. It was a different silence than she had known in Massachusetts, where even the quietest nights carried the distant clatter of looms and the murmur of voices through thin walls. This silence was enormous, alive, pressing against her ears like cotton, broken only by the wind moving across the prairie and the faint, impossible distance between herself and everything she had ever known. She reached into her pocket and touched the letter one more time. I need a woman who can work. I do not need anything else." Nettie lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. The boards were rough and unfinished, dotted with knotholes that stared back at her like dark, unblinking eyes. Somewhere outside, a door creaked on rusty hinges. The barn, she thought, where Josiah Pettit was settling himself into the hay, and the horse smell, and the careful distance he kept between himself and everything that might hurt him. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would begin. Tomorrow she would find out if this dead land and this walled-off man had anything left to give. Tomorrow she would earn her place or discover there was no place to earn. But tonight she was here, and that was enough. If this beginning stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, perhaps a journey of your own, I would be honored to know where you are listening from today. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that remind us we are not alone in the hard and beautiful work of starting over. Nettie awoke before dawn. The darkness pressed against her like a weight. She lay still on the narrow bed, listening to the creak of the house settling, to the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the barn, to the absolute silence where birdsong should have been. No birds. The land was too dry even for birds. She pushed back the thin blanket and swung her feet to the floor. The boards were cold against her bare soles, rough with splinters that caught at her skin. She dressed quickly in the dark, her fingers finding buttons and laces by memory, and slipped out through the kitchen before the sun had cracked the horizon. The air outside tasted of dust and sage. Nettie stood on the porch, watching the sky lighten from black to gray to pale orange along the eastern edge. The single rocking chair sat empty beside her, its wood silvered by years of sun and wind. She did not sit in it. Instead, she stepped off the porch and walked toward the dead garden. The plots were even more desolate in the early light than they had seemed the night before. Raised beds built from weathered planks, filled with soil so dry it had turned to powder. A few brown stalks, the skeletons of plants that had once been something, tomatoes maybe, or beans, poked up at odd angles like grave markers in a forgotten cemetery. Nettie crouched beside the nearest bed. She scooped up a handful of dirt and let it sift through her fingers. Fine as flour, dead as ash, but not hopeless. Please, Lord, not hopeless. Her father had been a farmer before the drink took him, before her mother had packed their things and fled to the mills of Massachusetts, where at least the poverty came with a roof and regular wages. Nettie remembered bits and pieces, the smell of turned earth in spring, the satisfaction of seeds pushing through dark soil, her father's voice, rough with rare pride, as he showed her how to read the land. "Dark soil means water, Nettie girl," he had said once, pointing to a patch near the creek bed. "Plants know, roots know. You just gotta look where they are looking." Nettie stood. She wiped her hands on her skirt and began to walk. The property stretched farther than she had realized, past the barn where Josiah slept, past the empty corral with its fence posts leaning like tired old men, past the small shed that looked ready to collapse in the next strong wind. She walked with her eyes on the ground, scanning for any variation in color, any hint that moisture might be hiding beneath the cracked surface. Nothing, nothing, nothing. The sun climbed higher. Sweat prickled along her hairline, gathered in the hollow of her throat, soaked into the collar of her dress. Her mouth grew dry. Her boots raised small clouds of dust with every step, and still she walked, praying silently with each footfall. Then she saw the tree, an old oak, massive and gnarled. standing alone near the western edge of the property. Its leaves were sparse but green, impossibly, defiantly green in this landscape of brown and gray. The trunk was thick enough that 3 men holding hands could not have circled it, its roots spread out like fingers gripping the earth, refusing to let go. Nettie's pace quickened. She reached the oak and dropped to her knees beside its roots. The ground here was different. Not wet, not exactly, but darker, denser. When she pressed her palm flat against the soil, she felt something she had not felt anywhere else on this land. Coolness. Her heart kicked against her ribs like a mule in a stall. She scrambled to her feet and ran back toward the shed, her boots pounding against the hard earth, her breath coming fast and sharp in the morning air. The shed door groaned on its hinges, the sound like a cat with its tail caught. Inside, she found what she needed. A shovel with a cracked handle, its blade dulled by years of neglect, but still intact. She grabbed it and ran back to the oak, her shadow stretching long behind her. The first strike of metal against earth sent a jolt up her arms. The ground was harder than she had expected, packed tight by years of drought, stubborn as an old mule, resistant to any intrusion. Nettie adjusted her grip on the worn handle, planted her feet wide, and drove the blade down again, and again, and again. Sweat soaked through the back of her dress, turning the brown calico dark between her shoulder blades. Blisters formed on her palms, hot and tight, threatening to burst with every swing. Her shoulders burned, her lower back screamed for mercy. But she kept digging, widening the hole inch by stubborn inch, going deeper into the earth that seemed determined to keep its secrets. 1 foot down, then 2. A meadowlark called somewhere in the distance, the first bird she had heard since arriving. Nettie paused, chest heaving, and listened to its song. A good omen, her mother would have said. A sign that something was about to change. The soil began to change too. Darker now, clumping together instead of crumbling to powder. Nettie's arms shook with exhaustion, her muscles trembling like leaves in a storm. But she did not stop, could not stop. Something was down there. She could feel it the way her father had taught her to feel it. That instinct for water that lived in the bones of anyone who had ever worked the land and loved it. 3 feet down. The shovel struck something soft. Nettie froze. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the hole, ignoring the dirt that smeared across her dress, and reached down with bare hands. Her fingers sank into mud. Actual mud. Wet and cold and wonderfully, impossibly alive. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. She dug with her hands now, scooping out handfuls of dark earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tore at her throat. The hole deepened. The mud grew wetter, and then water. It seeped up through the bottom of the hole, slow and steady as a heartbeat, pooling around her fingers like a secret finally willing to be told. Nettie sat back on her heels and stared at it. Her hands were black with mud. Her dress was ruined beyond any hope of washing clean. Her whole body trembled with exhaustion that went bone deep. But there was water. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough for the pool to widen, for the water to rise an inch then 2. Long enough for the sun to climb to its midday position, beating down on her unprotected head with all the mercy of a blacksmith's forge. Long enough for something half buried in the mud near the roots to catch her eye. Nettie reached for it, a scrap of fabric, white cotton gone gray with years of burial, tangled among the oak's roots as if the tree itself had been holding on to it. She pulled it free carefully, brushing away the wet earth. A handkerchief, small and delicate, with fine embroidery along one corner. She turned it toward the light and traced the stitching with her muddy fingertip. A single letter, worked in thread that had once been blue, but had faded to the pale color of a winter sky. Lenora. It had to be. The first wife. The one who grew everything. This handkerchief had been hers, lost or buried here beside the tree where the water ran deep and the roots held fast. Nettie folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket without a word. Some things were not meant to be shared until the right moment came. She was still kneeling there when the shadow fell across her. Nettie looked up. Josiah stood at the edge of the hole, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The sun was behind him, turning him into a dark silhouette against the bright sky. In his hand he held the tin cup, steam rising from its contents like a prayer going up to heaven. He did not speak, just stared at the water seeping up from the earth, at Nettie's mud-caked hands, at the hole she had dug with nothing but a broken shovel and sheer stubbornness, and maybe a little bit of faith. "You found it," he said finally. His voice sounded strange, thick, like there was something caught in his throat that he could not quite swallow. Nettie looked at her hands. The blisters had burst on both palms, leaving raw red patches that stung where the mud had worked its way in. Dirt was caked under her fingernails, ground into the lines of her skin like it meant to stay forever. "It was here the whole time," she said. Josiah set the cup down on the grass beside the hole. He lowered himself to his knees, moving slow and careful like a man approaching something he was not sure was real, and reached out to touch the water with his fingertips. His hand trembled, just slightly, just enough for Nettie to notice in the way the water rippled when his fingers broke the surface. 2 years, he said quietly. His voice had gone rough as sandpaper, raw as Nettie's hands. 2 years, I have been hauling water from town. 2 years, watching this land dry up and blow away. And you. He stopped, pulled his hand back. Water dripped from his fingers, catching the sunlight like tiny diamonds falling back to earth. You did good, he said. 3 words, spoken without looking at her, without any particular warmth or feeling. But Nettie heard what lived beneath them. The surprise he could not quite hide, the grudging respect he had not meant to show, the faintest crack in that careful distance he kept like a fence neither of them had agreed to build. She reached for the tin cup. The coffee was still hot, strong enough to make her eyes water, bitter enough to cut through the dust coating her throat. They sat together at the edge of the hole, watching the water rise, and neither of them spoke. But the silence felt different now, less empty, less like the silence between strangers, and more like the silence between 2 people who had just discovered they might have something to say to each other after all. Nettie drank her coffee and looked at the oak tree with its impossible green leaves spreading against the endless blue sky and touched the hidden handkerchief in her pocket and wondered what else this land had been hiding all along. 2 weeks passed. The morning Nettie decided to go to town, the sky was the color of bleached bone, pale and bright and promising nothing but heat. She had counted her remaining coins 3 times the night before, hunched over the kitchen table by lamplight. 47 cents, Enough for seeds if she was careful. She found Josiah in the barn mending a harness with hands that moved with the slow precision of a man who had done this particular task 1,000 times before. "I need to go to Bitter Creek," she said. He did not look up from the leather strap in his hands. What for? Seeds. The single word hung in the air between them like smoke from a chimney on a still day. Josiah's hands stopped moving. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the harness like it held some answer he could not quite decipher. "Take the wagon," he said finally. "The mare knows the way better than you do." "You are not coming." "Got work here." She waited for more, but nothing came. Just the creak of leather as he returned to his mending. The dismissal as clear as if he had spoken it aloud. Fine. She could do this alone. She had been doing things alone her whole life. The ride to town took nearly an hour. The mare was old and slow, picking her way along the rutted track with the careful patience of an animal who had long since stopped hurrying for anyone or anything. Nettie let her set the pace, watching the prairie scroll past on either side, brown and gold and endless, broken only by the occasional cluster of sage or the distant silhouette of a hawk circling lazy and patient overhead. Bitter Creek looked smaller in daylight than it had on the evening of her arrival. Meaner, somehow, more exposed. The buildings huddled together like survivors of some disaster, their paint peeling, their windows filmed with dust. The bell above the general store door jangled as she stepped inside. The store smelled of coffee beans and lamp oil and something musty and old that clung to the bolts of fabric stacked along the far wall like memories refusing to fade. A woman stood behind the counter, arranging cans on a shelf. Middle-aged, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same unforgiving landscape outside. She turned at Nettie's approach, and her eyes, sharp as tacks and missing nothing, traveled from Nettie's faded bonnet to her mud-stained boots. "Help you?" "I am looking for seeds," Nettie said, keeping her voice steady. "Vegetable seeds. Tomatoes, beans, squash, if you have it." The woman's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Well, I will be. You are the new one, are you not? Josiah Pettit's girl?" Nettie felt her spine stiffen. "I am his wife." "Not yet. You are not. Not proper like anyway." The woman's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Not quite a smirk. "I am Dovie Skaggs. I run this store. Run most things around here, truth be told, and I have seen 2 others come through here before you, both of them thinking they could make something of that dead patch of dirt Josiah calls a farm." She reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, Nettie could see packets of seeds arranged in neat rows, their paper envelopes yellowed with age but still intact. "First one lasted 6 months, Dovie continued, setting the box on the counter with a solid thunk. "Pretty thing. All blonde curls and big dreams and not a lick of sense. Ran off with a drummer who came through selling patent medicines and promises. Left Josiah a note pinned to the kitchen table. Did not even have the decency to say goodbye to his face. Nettie's fingers found the seed packets, moving through them with practiced ease. Tomatoes, 5 cents. Beans, 5 cents. Squash, 5 cents. She counted silently. Second one stayed longer. Almost a year. Dovie leaned her elbows on the counter, settling in. Her eyes never left Nettie's face. Quiet woman. Did not talk much. Kept to herself mostly. Her name was Pearl. One morning, Josiah woke up and she was just gone. Like smoke in a strong wind. Took the horse and whatever cash she could find and headed east. Never heard from her again. Not a word, not a letter, nothing. 15 cents for 3 packets. That would leave her 32 cents for emergencies. Nettie gathered the seeds and placed them on the counter. I will take these. Dovey did not move to ring up the purchase. She was still watching Nettie with those sharp eyes, studying her like she was trying to read fine print in poor light. You know what both those women had in common, honey? Nettie met her gaze and held it. I reckon you are going to tell me whether I want to hear it or not. A surprised laugh burst from Dovey's throat. Short, sharp, genuine. Land's sakes, you have got a mouth on you. I like that. She shook her head, still chuckling. They were both looking for something Josiah could not give them. Romance maybe, or excitement, or just someone who would talk to them and make them feel like they mattered more than the cattle and the crops. That man has got a wall around his heart 10 feet high and made of solid stone. Built it himself, brick by careful brick. Every time someone walked away from him, she leaned closer. You think you are going to be the one to tear it down? Nettie counted out 15 cents and placed the coins on the counter one by one. The copper pennies were worn smooth from years of handling, warm from her pocket. I am not here to tear anything down, she said quietly. I am here to grow something. Dovey stared at her for a long moment. Then unexpectedly she laughed again. A real laugh this time, full-bodied and warm. Well, bless your heart, she said, scooping up the coins. That is the first sensible thing any of Josiah's women has ever said to me. She wrapped the seed packets in brown paper and handed them across the counter. Then she reached under the counter again and pulled out another seed packet. Tomatoes, Nettie could see. A different variety. She set it on top of Nettie's bundle. On the house, she said gruffly. Consider it a welcome gift. Or just an old woman's curiosity about whether you will prove me wrong. Nettie picked up the extra packet, her throat suddenly tight. Thank you, ma'am. Do not thank me yet, honey. Dovey's voice had gone serious again. You got a long road ahead of you. And Josiah Pettit is not an easy man to know. Then Dovey paused, glanced toward the door as if checking for ears, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. One more thing. Just between us. Pearl, the second one. She did not leave because of the loneliness or the hard work. She left because she found something in the barn. Letters, I think, or maybe a photograph. Something from the first wife. Something Josiah had been keeping hidden away like a secret he could not bear to let go of. Whatever it was, she was gone the next morning. Did not tell anyone what she found. Just packed up and disappeared like the devil himself was chasing her. The bell above the door jangled as a gust of wind pushed it open. Nettie felt the dry air against her face. What kind of letters? Dovey shrugged, but her eyes were watchful. Nobody knows. She never told a soul what she read. Nettie stepped out into the harsh afternoon sunlight. The dog sleeping on the porch did not lift its head. The wagon waited where she had left it, the old mare standing patiently with her head drooped low. She had barely reached the bottom step when a voice stopped her. Well now, you must be the new Mrs. Pettit. The man stood in the shade of the building next door, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and one boot propped behind him. Middle-aged with a round, well-fed face and small eyes that moved over Nettie the way a buyer's eyes moved over merchandise at an auction, his clothes were too clean for a rancher, his boots too polished for anyone who actually worked the land. Nettie straightened. I am Nettie Groves. Harlan Skaggs, the man said, pushing off the wall and extending his hand. Nettie did not take it. His smile did not falter. Dovey's husband. I own a fair bit of the land around Bitter Creek. Been trying to help your Josiah out for years now. That piece of property he is sitting on, well, he shook his head with an expression of practiced sympathy that did not reach his eyes. Hate to say it plainly, but that land is not worth the dirt it is made of. Has not been for years. Dry as a bone. No water, no future. Nettie said nothing. She watched him the way she had learned to watch men like him in the factories. Men who smiled while they counted what they could take from you. Now I am a reasonable man, Harlan continued, and I have made Josiah a fair offer more than once. Buy the whole lot at a price that would set him up nice in town. Give him a fresh start. He could work for me even. I always need good hands. He spread his palms wide as if presenting a gift. But that stubborn fool will not listen to sense. The land is not for sale, Nettie said. Harlan's smile thinned. Just slightly. Just enough. Not yet, he said. But winter will come, Miss Groves. It always does. And when it does, you might find that stubborn is just another word for foolish. He tipped his hat and walked away. Nettie watched him go, feeling the seed packets solid and warm in her pocket, feeling the weight of his words, and the particular kind of threat that lived inside a smile. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and clicked her tongue at the mare. The wagon lurched into motion. She had seeds to plant, a garden to build, a future to fight for. But as the wagon rattled down the dusty track toward home, two things circled in her mind like hawks riding the thermals: letters in the barn, and a man who wanted the land bad enough to wait. 5 weeks since the seeds went into the ground. Nettie crouched at the edge of the garden plot, watching the first pale shoots push through the dark soil like tiny green fingers reaching for the sun. The tomato seedlings were strongest, 3 inches tall already, their leaves unfurling with a determination that made her chest tight. The beans had sprouted in neat rows, soldiers standing at attention, and the squash was just beginning to show. Fat little stems shouldering aside the dirt that had tried so hard to hold them down. Something had shifted since the well. Small things. A nod across the breakfast table when she set his coffee down. The way Josiah had started leaving the pot warming on the stove when he knew she would be coming in from the garden. The second chair pulled out from the wall now, positioned at the table as if someone might actually use it. Nettie used it. Every evening. And every evening, the silence between them grew a little less like distance and a little more like the kind of quiet that exists between people who do not need to fill every moment with words. One night over supper, she told him about her childhood in Massachusetts. Not the hard parts. Not the nights her father came home stinking of whiskey and rage. Just the small memories that surfaced sometimes like bubbles in a slow creek. The way her mother used to sing old hymns while hanging laundry on the line behind their tenement building. The taste of wild blueberries picked from the bushes that grew along the railroad tracks, sweet and warm from the summer sun. Josiah had not responded, had not even looked up from his plate. His fork moved mechanically from plate to mouth, but he had stopped chewing. His whole body had gone still, leaning slightly forward like a man straining to hear distant music. When she had finished, he nodded once and returned to his meal without comment. But something in the air between them had shifted, like wind changing direction before a storm. It was late one night, long after supper, when Nettie could not sleep. The heat pressed down on the little house like a hand, and the air inside was thick and still. She slipped out through the kitchen to stand on the porch, hoping for a breeze. That was when she heard it. Not the coyotes, not the wind, something else, coming from the barn. A sound so quiet she might have missed it if the night had not been perfectly, terribly still. A man crying, not loud, not dramatic. The muffled, broken sound of someone pressing his face into his hands and trying to hold the grief inside his chest where no one could see it. The sound of a man who had been alone so long he had forgotten that walls have ears and night has a way of carrying secrets. Nettie stood on the porch and listened. Her hand gripped the rough wooden railing. Her throat ached with something she could not name. She wanted to go to him, wanted to push open the barn door and sit beside him in the hay and tell him that grief was not something you had to carry alone, that it was all right to let someone see you break. But she did not, because she understood something in that moment that she had not understood before. The wall Josiah had built around himself was not coldness. It was not indifference. It was not the cruelty of a man who did not care. It was armor. The last protection of a man who had cared too much and lost too many times and could not survive another wound. Nettie went back inside. She lay down on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence that came after the crying stopped. And she made a quiet promise to herself. She would not push. She would not pry. She would not try to tear down his wall. She would simply be there, steady and patient and present, until the day he felt safe enough to open the gate himself. The next morning, Nettie went to the barn to fetch a hoe. Josiah was already gone, out checking the cattle in the eastern pasture. The barn was quiet, smelling of hay and horse sweat and old leather warmed by the early sun. She found the hoe, hanging on its nail, by the door. But as she turned to leave, her eye caught something in the far corner. Something that had not been there before. Or perhaps she had simply never looked closely enough to notice. A canvas tarp draped over a shape that was too angular, too deliberate to be a pile of supplies. Beside it, half hidden in shadow, a loose floorboard sat slightly askew. And beneath it, just barely visible, the corner of a wooden box. Nettie's heart went still in her chest. Then it began to pound so hard she could feel it in her wrists, in her neck, behind her eyes. Letters in the barn. Something the second wife found. Something that made her run. Nettie stood there for a long time, staring at that corner, at the box she could so easily reach down and open. Every question she had carried since her first night in this house, every mystery that Dovey Skaggs had planted in her mind, every silence Josiah had filled with absence instead of answers, all of it pointed to that box like a compass pointing north. She did not open it. She picked up the hoe and walked out of the barn and back to the garden where her seedlings were waiting for water and weeding, and the steady, patient care of hands that knew how to coax life from unwilling soil. But all that day, as she worked the rows and carried water from the spring and felt the sun beat down on her back like a blacksmith's hammer, the question followed her, circling like a hawk that had spotted something moving in the grass below. What was in that box, and was she brave enough to find out? The clouds came without warning. One moment the sky was pale and empty as a picked bone. The next, a dark bruise was spreading across the western horizon, rolling toward the farm with the slow, deliberate menace of something that had been gathering its strength for a long time and was finally ready to let go. Nettie was in the garden checking the tomato plants when the first cool breeze touched her face like a blessing. She straightened and looked west. The clouds were closer now, heavy and gray, their bottoms flat and dark with the promise of moisture. The wind picked up, carrying a smell she had not realized she had been missing until this very moment. That particular scent of rain coming. Wet earth and sky and something electric that made her skin prickle and the fine hairs on her arms stand at attention. She barely had time to think before the sky split open. Not a gentle shower. Not the light mist she remembered from Massachusetts Springs. A downpour. A deluge. Like someone had tipped over a bucket the size of the whole sky and let it fall. The rain came down in sheets, driven sideways by the wind, soaking through Nettie's dress in seconds. The garden, the seedlings. They would drown or get beaten into the mud if she did not cover them. She ran for the shed, 30 yards across ground that was already turning to slick brown muck beneath her boots. She went down hard on the third step, hands first, sinking into mud up to her wrists, then knees, then hip, cold wet earth soaking through her dress and petticoats until she could not tell where she ended and the ground began. She pushed herself up and kept running. The shed door stuck. She yanked at it once, twice, her fingers slipping on the wet wood. On the third pull, it flew open. She grabbed the burlap sacks, 3 of them, barely enough, and ran back out into the storm. The garden was in chaos. Water streamed down the rows, pooling in the low spots, carving tiny rivers through the soil she had worked so hard to prepare. The tomato plants bent nearly double under the assault, their tender stems threatening to snap. Nettie threw herself down beside the first row and draped burlap over the plants, pressing the edges deep into the mud to hold them in place. "Nettie!" Josiah's voice, nearly lost in the roar of the rain. She looked up, blinking water from her eyes. He was running toward her from the barn, his hat gone, his dark hair plastered flat to his skull. He dropped to his knees beside her, mud splattering across his already soaked shirt, and grabbed one of the burlap sacks. "I will take this row," he shouted over the din. "You get the beans." They worked without speaking, moving down the rows on their hands and knees like penitents crawling toward an altar. The rain hammered down on Nettie's back, ran into her eyes and ears and mouth, soaked through every layer of clothing until she could not remember what it felt like to be dry and warm. Her fingers were numb, her knees ached where they had been grinding into the muddy ground. But she kept going, kept covering, kept fighting to save what they had built together from seeds and water and stubborn hope. When the last plant was protected, she sat back on her heels and looked at Josiah. He was kneeling in the mud 3 feet away, rain streaming down his face like tears, like baptism, like something washing clean. His shirt had gone transparent with water, clinging to his shoulders and chest. His hands hung at his sides, caked with mud to the wrists, and he was looking at her, not past her, not through her like she was made of glass and air, at her, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something raw, something unguarded, something stripped bare by the storm the way lightning strips bark from a tree. Nettie's breath caught in her throat. "You are soaking wet," he said. His voice was different, lower, like something had come loose inside him that he could not put back. "So are you." Neither of them moved. The rain continued to fall, but softer now. The worst of the storm already passing over them like a train heading east. Nettie could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, could feel the cold water running down her back and the mud seeping through her dress. Could feel something else, something warm despite the cold. Something terrifying spreading through her chest like sunrise. Josiah's hand moved. He reached toward her face, slowly, like he was approaching a wild bird that might take flight at any sudden movement. His fingers touched her cheek, just barely, just enough to brush away a strand of wet hair that had plastered itself to her skin. Nettie held absolutely still, barely breathed. "You stayed," he said quietly. The words seemed to cost him something precious, drawn up from somewhere deep like water from a well. "The storm came and you stayed out here in the mud and the rain." "Of course I stayed. The plants. That is not what I mean." She knew what he meant. 8 weeks now. 8 weeks of hard work and silence and that endless distance between them. 8 weeks of waiting for her to pack her bags and leave like the others, to prove that his wall had been built for good reason. "I told you," Nettie said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I am not going anywhere." Josiah's hand was still on her face, his thumb moving now, tracing the line of her cheekbone like he was memorizing the shape of it. His eyes were fixed on hers, searching for something. Doubt, maybe. Deception. Whatever it was, he had learned to expect from the women who had come before her and left him standing alone. Nettie did not look away. "Come inside," he said finally. "You will catch your death out here." He stood and offered her his hand. Nettie took it. His grip was strong, his palm rough with calluses that matched her own. And when he pulled her to her feet, he did not let go immediately. They stood there in the rain, hands clasped, the garden stretched out around them like a promise half kept. Then Josiah did something she had not expected. He laughed. It was a small sound at first, barely more than a breath, rusty as an old gate hinge that had not been oiled in years. But it was a laugh, genuine and surprised. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. Just you have got mud on your nose. Looks like you tried to plant yourself along with the tomatoes. So do you. Looks like a hog has been rooting in your hair." They walked back to the house together, leaving muddy footprints across the porch. Inside, Josiah went to the stove and started building a fire while Nettie found towels. Flour sacks, really. Thin and rough, but blessedly dry. She handed one to him. Their fingers touched. Neither of them pulled away. "Josiah," Nettie said. She did not know what she was going to say next. Did not know what question she wanted to ask or what truth she was reaching for. She only knew that something had changed between them out there in the rain, working side by side to save something they had built together, something that mattered. He looked at her, waiting. "The women before me," she said slowly, picking her words like she was picking her way across a creek on slippery stones. "The ones who left. What happened to them? Really?" His face closed. Not all the way. Not the complete shutdown she had seen in those first weeks. But enough. The familiar guard rising back into place. Mortar still wet between the stones. "They left," he said flatly. "That is what happened." "But why?" "Mrs. Skaggs said the second one found something in the barn. Letters, maybe, or—" Josiah's hand tightened on the flour sack towel. His knuckles went white. "Dovie Skaggs talks too much. Always has." "Josiah." "Leave it alone, Nettie." He turned away from her toward the stove where the fire was just catching. Small flames licking at the kindling. His shoulders were rigid. His back a wall of its own, as solid and unyielding as the one around his heart. Nettie stood in the middle of the kitchen, the wet flour sack hanging forgotten from her hand, and watched him retreat into that familiar silence like a turtle pulling into its shell. "Whatever it is you are hiding," she said quietly to his back, "it is not going to change what I do. I am staying either way." Josiah did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders drop. Just slightly. Just enough. "I know," he said. His voice came out scraped thin, like something dragged over stone. "That is what scares me." Nettie set down the towel and walked to where he stood by the stove, close enough to feel the heat beginning to radiate from the iron. She did not touch him. Was not sure that would be welcome, but she stood near enough that he could feel her presence, solid and real and not going anywhere. "You do not have to tell me tonight," she said gently. "You do not have to tell me ever if you do not want to. But whatever happened with them, it is not going to happen with me." Josiah was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled and popped as it grew stronger. "It might," he said finally. "It will not." He turned to face her then. His eyes were dark in the dim kitchen, troubled, full of something she could not name but wanted desperately to understand. "You do not know that." "No," Nettie admitted. "I do not. But I am choosing to believe it anyway. That is what faith is it not? Choosing to believe when you cannot see the proof." Josiah studied her face for a long moment. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it, because some of the tension drained from his shoulders like water from a cracked bucket. "You are stubborn as a mule," he said. "So I have been told." That almost laugh again, that sound like a door opening for the first time in years, hinges protesting but giving way. "Get some dry clothes on," he said. "I will make coffee." Nettie nodded and turned toward the bedroom. She was almost to the faded curtain when his voice stopped her. "Nettie." She looked back. Josiah was standing by the stove, the firelight casting dancing shadows across his face. He looked older in that light, the lines deeper, the weariness more visible. But he also looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, gathering his courage to jump. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for the garden, for—" He stopped, shook his head like he was trying to shake loose words that would not come. "Just thank you." Nettie smiled, feeling the warmth of it spreading through her chest. "You are welcome." She went to change her clothes, leaving him alone in the kitchen with the growing fire and whatever secrets he was still carrying on those broad, weary shoulders. The weeks that followed moved like water finding its course. Slowly at first, feeling for the path of least resistance, then gradually settling into a rhythm that felt almost natural. The distance between them continued to close in increments so small that Nettie could not have pointed to any single moment and said there, "That is when it changed." But it was changing. She could feel it the way you feel a season turning before the calendar says it should. Josiah began to talk. Not much. Not the kind of easy, flowing conversation that came naturally to some men, but more than the 5 or 6 word sentences she had grown accustomed to. One evening over supper, after Nettie had told him about her mother's singing and the blueberries by the railroad tracks, he set down his fork and said quietly, "My father drank too." Nettie went still. She did not speak, did not move. Just waited the way you wait for a deer to step out of the tree line, knowing that the slightest sound will send it running. He was not a bad man, Josiah continued. His eyes were fixed on the table, on his own rough hands spread flat against the wood. Not at first, but the drink made him mean, made him forget who he was supposed to be. My mother took the worst of it. She never complained, never said a word against him. Just kept putting supper on the table and mending his shirts and pretending the bruises were from walking into doors. His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his stubbled skin. She died when I was 14. Doc said it was her heart, but I knew better. Nettie reached across the table and laid her hand over his. He flinched at the touch. A tiny, involuntary movement that broke her heart, but he did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time. Two people at a kitchen table with their hands touching, and the fire crackling low in the stove, and the prairie wind singing its endless song outside the windows. And something in the silence between them began to feel less like distance and more like the kind of closeness that does not need words to make itself known. The next morning, Nettie took the handkerchief from its hiding place in her trunk. She held it up to the window light, running her thumb over the embroidered L. The stitching was exquisite. Tiny, even loops worked with the kind of patience and care that spoke of a woman who found beauty in small things, who took time with details, who believed that even something as ordinary as a handkerchief deserved to be made with love. Lenora, the woman who grew everything, the woman whose seeds Nettie was now coaxing back to life in the garden outside. She folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it in her apron pocket, close to her heart, and went out to tend the plants. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot and still, when Nettie heard hooves on the hard-packed dirt. She was in the garden, staking the tomato plants which had grown tall enough to need support, when the shadow of a horse and rider fell across the rows. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her stomach drop. Harlan Skaggs sat atop a fine bay horse, his clothes still too clean, his smile still too wide. He was looking at the garden, at the green rows of vegetables thriving in soil that everyone in Bitter Creek had given up for dead. And there was something in his eyes that Nettie did not like. A brightness. A hunger. The look of a man doing calculations in his head and liking the numbers. "Well, well," Harlan said, swinging down from his horse with the easy grace of a man accustomed to making himself at home wherever he pleased. "Would you look at this? Green as Eden itself." He walked along the edge of the garden, his polished boots leaving prints in the soft earth. He reached down and touched a tomato leaf, rubbing it between his fingers. "How did you manage it? Last I heard, this whole property was dry as a sermon on Sunday." "We found water," Nettie said. She kept her voice flat, neutral, giving nothing away. Harlan's eyebrows rose. "Did you now?" He looked toward the old oak tree in the distance and then back at the garden with that calculating expression that made Nettie's skin crawl. "Well, that changes things considerably, does it not?" He turned to face her fully. His smile was still in place, but his eyes had gone hard, like stones with a fresh coat of paint. "I came to talk about the property taxes," he said. The tone had changed. "Drop the neighborly pretense the way a snake drops its skin. Josiah is 2 years behind. County has been patient, but patience has a limit. Come winter, if those taxes are not settled, the county will have no choice but to seize the land and sell it at auction." He paused to let the words sink in like water into cracked earth. "Now I have always said I am willing to help. A fair price for a fair piece of land. No shame in knowing when to cut your losses." Nettie pulled the tomato stake from the ground and drove it back in with a force that made her shoulders ache. Drove it deep and straight and solid. "Mr. Skaggs," she said without looking at him, "I believe I told you once already. The land is not for sale." Harlan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the smile was gone entirely. "You are a smart woman, Miss Groves. I can see that. Smarter than the others. So I will speak plainly. That man in there, he nodded toward the barn where Josiah was working. He is broken. Has been since his first wife died. Maybe before. You can plant all the gardens you want, dig all the wells you can find, but you cannot fix what is wrong with Josiah Pettit. And when winter comes, and the pipes freeze and the cattle start dying, and you realize that stubbornness does not keep you warm at night, you will wish you had taken my offer when you had the chance. He mounted his horse and tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. You know where to find me. Nettie watched him ride away. The dust from his horse's hooves settled slowly on the tomato leaves. She stood in the garden for a long time after he was gone, her hands gripping the stake she had just driven into the ground, feeling the rough wood bite into her palms. That evening, she asked Josiah about the taxes. He was at the table eating the stew she had made from canned beef and dried beans, and his jaw tightened at the question the way it always did when something touched too close to the truth he was guarding. I will handle it, he said. How? I said I will handle it. Nettie looked at him across the table, at the lines around his eyes, at the gray threading through his hair, at the way his shoulders carried the weight of everything he refused to share. She wanted to push, wanted to demand answers, but she remembered the sound of him crying in the barn and the way his hand had trembled when he touched the water she had found. She remembered the promise she had made to herself. Do not push. Do not pry. Be patient. All right, she said softly, but if you need help, I am here. Josiah looked up from his plate. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. Something that looked like the first green shoot pushing through hard-packed soil, fragile and new and not quite ready to face the sun. I know, he said. After supper, they sat on the porch. Nettie on the top step because there was still only one rocking chair and she would not sit in it. Josiah in the chair, its runners creaking softly against the boards. The sky was enormous above them, thick with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Josiah told a joke, a bad one, something about a preacher and a mule that did not make much sense and had no proper punchline. But the way he told it, halting and uncertain, like a man remembering how to use muscles that had gone stiff from years of neglect, made Nettie laugh. And the sound of her laughter made him smile. Not the almost smile she had grown accustomed to, a real one, small and startled and gone almost as soon as it appeared, but real. They sat in comfortable silence after that. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of cricket song and starlight and the unspoken understanding that something was growing between them, fragile as the seedlings in the garden, and just as determined to reach the light. 3 days later, the letter came. Nettie was hanging laundry on the line she had strung between the porch post and the fence when she heard hooves and the jingle of a mail carrier's harness. The rider did not stop, just leaned down from his saddle and dropped a single envelope into the rusted tin box nailed to the fence post and rode on. Nettie dried her hands on her apron and walked to the box. The envelope was plain, no return address. The postmark read Boston. Her name was written on the front in a hand she did not recognize. Neat, precise letters that looked like they had been formed with the careful deliberation of someone who wanted to make absolutely sure the message reached its intended destination. She opened it standing there by the fence, with the Wyoming wind tugging at her bonnet strings, and the smell of clean laundry and sage in her nostrils. Inside was a single sheet of paper, one line of writing, no signature. I know where you are. The debt is not settled. Nettie's hands began to shake. The paper trembled between her fingers like a leaf in a gale. She read the line again and again. as if reading it enough times might change the words into something less frightening. She knew who had sent it. There was only one person it could be: Otis Leach, the man who had loaned her mother money for the doctors when the consumption took hold, the man who had come to the boarding house 3 days after the funeral with his ledger book and his thin smile and his insistence that the debt now belonged to Nettie. $200. Her mother had signed the paper. Nettie had not. The debt was not legally hers, and she knew it. But Otis Leach was not a man who concerned himself with what was legal. He was a man who dealt in shame and fear and the knowledge that a woman alone in the world had very few places to hide. Nettie looked down at the letter one more time. Then she struck a match from the box she kept in her apron pocket for lighting the stove. She held the flame to the corner of the paper and watched it curl and blacken and dissolve into ash that the wind carried away across the prairie like dark snow. The words were gone, but the fear remained, sitting in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. She went back to hanging the laundry and did not mention the letter to Josiah. Some burdens, she told herself, were hers to carry, at least for now. At least until she figured out how far a man like Otis Leach was willing to travel to collect a debt that was not owed. The sheets snapped in the wind like sails on a ship headed somewhere she could not see, and Nettie's hands, still trembling, kept working. Because that was what she knew how to do. That was the one thing that had never failed her: work and faith, and the stubborn refusal to stop moving forward, even when the road ahead disappeared into darkness. 3 weeks without rain. Nettie stood at the edge of the garden, watching the tomato leaves curl inward like fists clenching against pain. The soil had cracked again. Deep fissures running between the rows like veins on the back of an old man's hand. The dark earth she had worked so hard to nurture, turning gray and powdery at the surface. The bean plants drooped despite the burlap shade she had rigged over them with sticks and prayer. The squash vines had stopped spreading, their leaves going yellow at the edges like paper held too close to a flame. The spring under the oak tree had slowed to a trickle. She had checked it that morning before dawn, kneeling in the dirt with her hands cupped beneath the seep like she was begging for alms. What had once been a steady flow, enough to fill a bucket in 10 minutes, now produced barely a cupful in an hour. The underground water table was dropping, retreating deeper into the earth as the drought tightened its grip on the land like a miser clutching coins. Lord, please do not let it all be for nothing. The sun beat down on Nettie's shoulders, hot and merciless as a blacksmith's forge. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, soaking into the already damp fabric of her dress. Her lips were cracked and bleeding at the corners. Her throat felt like she had been swallowing sand. And the garden she had poured 10 weeks of her life into, every ounce of hope she had left, was dying right in front of her eyes. She heard Josiah's boots on the porch behind her. "Spring is almost dry," she said without turning around. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw by dust and desperation. "Another week like this, and there will not be anything left to save." He came to stand beside her. She could feel the heat radiating off his body, could smell the dust and sweat that clung to him after a morning of working with the cattle in the relentless sun. "I know. We need to do something, Josiah. I am not giving up." She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him take a half step back. "I did not come all the way out here to watch everything die. There has to be another source of water somewhere. A creek, a pond of Mahan, something we have not found yet." Josiah's jaw tightened. That familiar tension crept back into his shoulders. "There is nothing." I have been on this land 12 years come September. If there was water to be found, I would have found it by now. Then we haul it from town, from the creek you mentioned, from wherever we have to go to get it. I do not care if it takes all day and all night. I am not letting this garden die. It is just vegetables, Nettie. The words hit her like a slap across the face. She stared at him. Just vegetables. As if the past 10 weeks meant nothing at all. As if the hours she had spent on her hands and knees in this dirt, digging and planting and watering and weeding until her back screamed and her fingers bled, were worthless. It is not just vegetables, she said. Her voice came out low and tight, controlled the way you control a horse that wants to bolt. It is proof. Proof that something can grow here. Proof that this land is not dead and buried. Proof that She stopped herself, swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat. Josiah was watching her with that unreadable expression. Proof that you what? Nothing. Never mind. Nettie. I said never mind. She turned away from him, back toward the garden where her plants were dying one leaf at a time. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Josiah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. There is a spring. His voice came out slowly, like the words were being pulled from him against his will. Behind the eastern ridge, about 1.5 miles from here. It usually dries up come summer, but this year it might still have water. We'll not know until we check. Nettie's heart lurched. Why did you not tell me before? Because I did not think it would matter. Did not think... He paused, and she saw something flicker across his face like lightning in the distance. Something that looked almost like shame. Did not think you would still be here by now, if I am being honest. The words hung in the air between them. Nettie understood then. He had expected her to leave, same as the others. Expected her to give up, pack her bags, follow the path of the women who had come before. Why share secrets with someone who was already halfway out the door? I am still here, she said. I can see that. And I am not leaving. I know. That is what I cannot figure out. Why you would stay when everyone else ran. He turned and walked toward the barn. Nettie watched him, confused, until he emerged a moment later carrying 2 more buckets and a length of rope coiled over his shoulder. Come on, he said. I will show you where the spring is, but we had best hurry. Sun will be down in 6 hours, and we have got a long walk ahead. The spring was exactly where he had said it would be. A narrow cleft in the rock face of a low ridge. Water seeping out from somewhere deep underground. It was not much. A thin stream barely enough to wet the rocks beneath it, but it was water, and it was flowing. And Nettie dropped to her knees beside it with a sound that was half laugh, half sob, half prayer of thanksgiving. They filled every bucket they had brought. The return journey was slow, the weight of the water forcing them to move carefully over the uneven ground. They made 4 trips that first night, walking back and forth in the moonlight like pilgrims on some ancient path, carrying water the way others carried prayers. The first night, Nettie's hands bled. She did not notice until they were halfway back from the spring. The rope handles of the buckets cutting into palms already raw from days of digging and hauling. Josiah saw it when they stopped to rest. He grabbed her wrists and turned her hands over in the moonlight. Dark smears covered her palms, blood mixing with dirt. You are bleeding. Why did you not say something? It does not matter. The devil, it does not. He pulled out a knife, the blade catching moonlight, and cut a strip from the bottom of his shirt. He began wrapping her right hand, his movements quick but gentle, his calloused fingers brushing against her torn skin. "You are ruining your shirt," she managed. "I have got other shirts. Only got one of you." The words landed somewhere deep in her chest and stayed there, warm and solid as a stone pulled from a fire. The second night was worse. Nettie's hands had stiffened overnight, the muscles seizing up, the wounds crusting over into painful scabs that cracked open the moment she gripped the bucket handles. She rewrapped the bandages herself before they left. The pain was constant now. A dull fire that flared into agony with every movement. They were on the third trip when Josiah began to talk. Not about the water or the drought or the farm. About Lenora. "My first wife was named Lenora," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his face blank as a fresh-wiped slate. "She was the one who planted the garden. The first one. Before it all died, she grew tomatoes and beans and squash, same as you are trying to do. Had a real gift for making things grow." Nettie barely dared to breathe, afraid that any sound might break whatever spell had loosened his tongue. "We were married 3 years, good years mostly, hard but good. Then she got sick, some kind of fever that came on fast and would not break no matter what we tried. Doctor came out from town, but there was not anything he could do. She died in the bedroom, the same room you sleep in now." His voice cracked, a fissure running through stone. "I could not save her, could not do a blessed thing but sit there, holding her hand and watching her slip away, inch by inch. After that, I let the garden die, let everything die. Did not seem like there was any point in growing things, when they were just going to be taken away from you in the end." Nettie's throat ached. She wanted to go to him, to touch him, to offer some comfort for a wound that had clearly never healed, but she sensed that any movement might shatter the fragile thread of his confession. "The second wife," she said carefully. "What happened with her?" "Pearl found Lenora's things. Letters, a photograph, a lock of hair I had kept in a box. She thought I was still carrying a torch for a dead woman. Thought she would never be able to compete with a ghost. She was gone before sunrise. Was she right? I do not know. She did not stay long enough for either of us to find out. The third night, Nettie broke. She did not mean to. Had promised herself she would not. Had repeated it like a prayer with every step. I will not break. I will not break." But they were on the last trip. The spring barely producing enough water to fill the buckets, and her body simply gave out. One moment she was walking. The next, her knees buckled. She went down in the middle of the path, the buckets crashing beside her, water soaking into the dust and disappearing forever. She tried to get up. Her arms would not support her weight. She tried again. Her vision went black at the edges. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. "Nettie, Nettie." Josiah's voice, but far away, like he was shouting from the bottom of a deep well. She felt herself being lifted, cradled against a chest that was hard with muscle and damp with sweat. The world tilted and spun. "I can walk," she mumbled. "No, you cannot. The water. Forget the water." His voice broke on the words like ice cracking on a frozen river. "I do not care about the garden. I do not care about the tomatoes or the beans or any of it. I care about you, and I cannot watch you destroy yourself anymore." It is tearing me apart. He carried her home, laid her on the narrow bed. Nettie reached for his wrist before he could turn away. "Stay," she said. "Please just stay with me." Silence, the kind that stretched and pulled, filling up all the empty spaces in the room. Then Josiah turned back. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "Okay," he said quietly. "I will stay." Their foreheads touched, his breath warm on her face, her hand resting against his pulse point, feeling his heart beating fast, faster than it should have been. "I am not going to leave," she murmured. "Whatever happens." "I know," he said, his voice rough, broken at the edges. "That is what terrifies me more than anything." "Why?" "Because Lenora stayed too. She stayed and she fought, and she worked herself to the bone. And then one day, she got sick, and I could not." His voice broke. He looked away. "I could not save her. And afterward, I swore I would never let myself care that much about anyone again." Nettie's chest ached like something inside had cracked open. "I am not Lenora," she said softly. "I know. And I am not the others, the ones who left. I know that too." She pushed herself up on one elbow, ignoring the screaming protest of her muscles. Josiah was still looking away, his jaw tight, his shoulders rigid. "Look at me," she said. "Josiah, look at me." Slowly he turned. His eyes met hers, and Nettie saw everything laid bare. The fear, the grief, the desperate hope he had been fighting against for months, like a man fighting a flood. "Promise me," he said. The words came out scraped raw. "I need to hear you promise." "I promise." He stared at her. Then slowly, he lowered his forehead to rest against hers. His eyes closed. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." They stayed like that, foreheads touching, hands clasped, breathing the same air until Nettie's exhaustion finally pulled her under. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was his voice, so quiet she might have imagined it. "I care about you too," he said, "more than I should, more than I ever meant to." Nettie smiled in the darkness and slept. When she woke, the sun was high and Josiah was gone. The space beside her on the bed was cold, and for one terrible moment she thought, but no, she could hear him outside. The sound of buckets clanking and water splashing on dry earth. He had not left. He had just gone back to work. Same as always. Nettie sat up slowly. Everything ached. Her hands throbbed. But she was alive. And the garden was alive. And Josiah was still here. She stood and walked to the window. He was in the garden, pouring water over the tomato plants with careful, measured movements. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his back bent with exhaustion. But he kept going, plant by plant, row by row. Then Nettie saw the horse tied to the fence post near the house, and the two men standing by the porch. One she recognized instantly. Harlan Skaggs. Same polished boots. Same smile that never quite reached his eyes. The other man she had never seen before. Thin as a fence rail with a narrow face and a dark suit that looked absurd against the backdrop of dust and prairie grass. He held a leather satchel under one arm, and he was watching the house with the particular patience of a man who had traveled a long way to collect something he believed he was owed. Nettie's blood went cold. She knew that posture. knew that patient, predatory stillness. She had seen it in the boarding house hallway in Massachusetts 3 days after her mother's funeral, when a man in a dark suit had appeared at her door with a ledger book and a smile that held no warmth at all. Otis Leach. She gripped the window frame until her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps that fogged the glass. He had come. The letter had not been an empty threat. He had actually traveled over 1,000 miles to find her, and Harlan Skaggs had brought him here. She heard voices on the porch, Josiah's boots on the steps, the low murmur of Harlan's voice, smooth and reasonable, and dripping with the practiced sympathy of a man who sold poison in medicine bottles. And then Leach's voice, higher, sharper, cutting through the morning air like a blade through old cloth. I am here regarding a debt owed by Miss Nettie Groves, $200 outstanding. I have the documentation right here. The screen door opened. Josiah's shadow fell across the kitchen floor. Nettie. She came out onto the porch. The sunlight was blinding after the dimness of the house. She had to squint to see their faces. Harlan standing to one side with his arms crossed and that satisfied expression of a man watching a plan come together exactly as he had designed it. Leach in the center, his satchel open now, papers in his hand. And Josiah, standing between them and her with an expression she could not read. His eyes moved from Leach to the papers to Nettie. And in them she saw something that made her stomach drop through the floor. Doubt. This man says you owe him money, Josiah said. His voice was flat, carefully, deliberately flat. The voice of a man trying very hard not to feel anything at all. Leach stepped forward, papers extended like a weapon. Her mother signed a promissory note. $200 for medical expenses. Upon the mother's death, the obligation transfers to the next of kin. Standard practice. All perfectly legal. He smiled at Nettie. The same smile she remembered from the boarding house doorway. The smile of a spider watching a fly test the edges of the web. It has been quite a journey tracking you down, Miss Groves. You left Massachusetts rather suddenly. One might even say you fled. The word hung in the air. Fled. Like a criminal. Like a woman with something to hide. Harlan Skaggs shifted his weight and looked at Josiah with an expression of exaggerated concern. I am sorry about this, Josiah. Truly I am. I heard this fellow was asking around town, and I thought it only right to bring him out here directly rather than let the gossip spread. A man deserves to know if his wife has been keeping secrets. Nettie watched Josiah's face, watched something close behind his eyes. His jaw set. His gaze went somewhere she could not follow. His shoulders squared into that rigid line she knew so well. The posture of a man bracing himself for another departure, another betrayal, another woman who turned out to be something other than what she seemed. He did not look at her. He turned and walked toward the barn without a word. The door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. Nettie stood on the porch with Leach in his papers and Harlan in his smile and felt the world she had been building, seed by careful seed, crack beneath her feet like drought-stricken earth. Harlan tipped his hat. I will leave you two to sort this out, he said. And if Josiah comes to his senses about the land, he knows where to find me. He rode away. Leach remained, smiling his spider smile. Nettie looked at him. She looked at the papers in his hand. She looked at the barn where Josiah had disappeared, and she felt something rise up inside her. Not fear, not shame, not the old familiar urge to run that had carried her from Massachusetts to Wyoming. Anger, clean and hot and righteous as a blacksmith's forge. She turned to Leach and spoke in a voice that did not shake, that did not waver, that came from a place deeper than her aching hands and exhausted body, from the place where her mother's voice still lived. "You will leave this property," she said, "now. And if you come back with those counterfeit papers, I will see you exposed in front of every man and woman in Bitter Creek." My mother signed that note. I did not. You know it, and I know it, and before the week is out, everyone else will know it too. Leach's smile faltered. Just for a moment. Just enough. Nettie stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn. She did not look back. The rest of that day, Josiah did not speak. Not at supper, not on the porch. He ate alone in the barn and did not come inside until long after the lamp in the kitchen had been extinguished. Nettie sat at the table in the darkness, staring at the empty chair across from her. The chair he had pulled out from the wall for her. The chair that had meant something when he moved it. That had meant welcome. That had meant stay. Now it sat empty. And the silence between them was no longer the comfortable quiet of two people who did not need words. It was the old silence, the first silence, the silence of a man who had decided it was safer to feel nothing at all. Nettie did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind and made a decision. She would not run. She would not hide. She would not wait for Josiah to come to her with his doubt and his questions. She would go to him, and she would tell the truth, all of it. And then she would walk into Bitter Creek and face Otis Leach in front of God and everyone. And she would do it alone. Because that was who she was. That was who she had always been. A woman with rough hands and an honest face who did not know how to be anything other than exactly what she was. And if that was not enough, then nothing ever would be. Nettie was up before the sun. She dressed in the dark, her fingers steady on the buttons, despite the trembling that had nothing to do with cold. She walked to the barn and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned. Inside, Josiah was sitting on a hay bale with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. He had not slept either. She could see it in the shadows beneath his eyes, in the way his shoulders curved inward, like a man trying to make himself smaller than he was. "I need you to listen," she said from the doorway. "And when I am done, you can decide what you want to believe." He did not look up, but he did not tell her to leave. My mother borrowed $200 from a man named Otis Leach to pay for doctors when the consumption took hold. She signed the note. I did not. When she died, the debt should have died with her. But Leach is not a man who lets go of what he thinks he is owed. He came to the boarding house 3 days after the funeral, told me I was responsible, told me he would drag my name through every street in Lowell if I did not pay. I had 47 cents to my name and nowhere to go. So I answered your advertisement, not because I was running from him, because I was running toward the only future I could find. She paused, drew a breath that hurt going down. I did not tell you because I was ashamed, not of the debt, of being the kind of woman who comes to a man's door with nothing but a carpet bag and a lie of omission. I should have told you the first day. I know that, and I am sorry. Josiah was still. The barn was quiet around them, dust motes drifting in the first pale light filtering through the cracks between the boards. Those papers he had, Josiah said finally. His voice sounded like it had been dragged up from a dry well. They are forgeries. Nettie blinked. You knew? My father was a drunk and a gambler. Men came to our door with forged notes my whole childhood. I can spot a counterfeit signature the way you can spot dead soil. I knew those papers were wrong the moment I saw them. Then why did you shut me out? Why did you walk away? Because for one moment I was back there again, standing in the kitchen, finding Pearl's note on the table, finding out that the woman I thought I knew had been keeping secrets. And I thought maybe. He stopped, swallowed hard enough that she could see his throat working. I thought maybe you were going to be the next one to leave. And I could not stand there and watch it happen, could not breathe through it one more time. So I walked away first. But I did not leave. No. He looked up at her then, his eyes red-rimmed and raw. You did not. Something shifted in his face. The wall did not go back up. It stayed down. Broken open like earth after rain. I know, he said. That is why I have been sitting here all night trying to figure out how to deserve it. Nettie crossed the barn and stood in front of him. You do not have to deserve it. You just have to let me stay. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Nettie left for Bitter Creek within the hour. She took the wagon alone. Josiah offered to come. She said no. This was hers to do. She found Otis Leach at the boarding house above the saloon, eating breakfast with the smug contentment of a man who believed he had already won. Nettie walked in without knocking. The room went quiet. 3 men at a nearby table stopped chewing and stared. Nettie spoke clearly enough for every ear in the room to hear. This man is carrying forged documents. He is attempting to collect a debt I never signed for, using papers that would not survive 5 minutes of examination by any judge or clerk in this territory. I am Nettie Groves. I came to Bitter Creek with 47 cents and 2 hands. I dug water from dead ground. I planted a garden in soil everyone said was finished. And I will not be run off by a man who makes his living preying on women who have no one to speak for them. She turned to Dovie Skaggs, who had appeared in the doorway with her arms crossed and her sharp eyes bright with something that looked very much like admiration. Mrs. Skaggs, would you be willing to examine these papers? Dovie took the documents from Leach's hand before he could protest. She held them to the light, turned them over, ran her finger along the signature line. This is not even good forgery, Dovie said flatly. The ink is wrong for an 1879 document, and the notary seal is smudged in a way that suggests it was applied with a potato stamp rather than an actual seal. She looked at Leach over the top of the papers. Mister, I do not know where you come from, but in Bitter Creek we do not take kindly to swindlers. Leach's face had gone the color of old cheese. He snatched his satchel from the table and stood. This is not over, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. The spider had been pulled from the web and set in the sun, and he did not like the light one bit. Yes, it is, Nettie said. He left. The door banged shut behind him. The men at the nearby table went back to their breakfast. Dovie folded the papers and tucked them into her apron pocket. I will keep these, she said. Evidence, in case that weasel ever shows his face again. Nettie stepped outside. The morning sun was warm on her face. And there at the end of the street, leaning against the wagon with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed, was Josiah. He had come, after all, not to rescue her, not to fight her battles, just to be there when she walked out. She walked toward him. He straightened, and as she got close enough to see his eyes, she saw something she had never seen there before. Not gratitude, not relief, something deeper and quieter. The look of a man watching someone become exactly who they were always meant to be. "You did not need me in there," he said. "No, but I am glad you are out here." He reached for her hand. She gave it. The clouds came on a Tuesday. Nettie saw them first, a dark smudge on the western horizon building slowly throughout the morning like a bruise spreading across pale skin. The wind picked up carrying that particular scent of rain, wet earth and sky and answered prayers. The rain came down in sheets. Nettie stood in the garden with her face turned up to the heavens, letting the water wash over her. Beside her, Josiah was doing the same. She started to laugh, a sound she barely recognized after all these weeks. He was laughing too. Not the cautious, almost laugh she had coaxed from him on the porch that starlit night. A real one, full and free, and startled out of him like a bird flushed from cover. And she reached out and took his hand, and they stood there in the downpour, two people grinning like fools, while the garden they had nearly killed themselves to save drank its fill. After the rain, she found it. A flower, small, yellow, perfect as a prayer answered, tucked among the leaves of the largest tomato plant. Josiah crouched beside her, his breath caught. "Lenora grew this variety," he said quietly. "I kept the seeds from her last crop, stored them in a tin in the barn. Never thought anyone would plant them again." Nettie reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the handkerchief. The white cotton with its embroidered L found buried in the mud beside the oak tree where the water ran deep and the roots held fast. "I found this the day I dug the well," she said, "near the roots. I think she would be glad to know her garden is growing again." Josiah took the handkerchief. His fingers traced the faded blue letter. His eyes went bright and wet, but he did not look away. He folded it carefully and pressed it against his chest. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping it safe." Nettie nodded. And in that moment, the ghost of Lenora was not a rival, or a shadow, or a weight. She was a woman who had loved this land and this man and had left something behind so that one day someone else could carry it forward. Then Josiah took Nettie's hand and led her into the barn. He pulled aside the canvas tarp she had seen weeks ago. Underneath was a rocking chair. New. The wood still pale and unfinished, smelling of fresh sawdust and linseed oil. He had sanded the armrests smooth as silk. "I have been working on it at night," he said, his voice gruff, almost embarrassed. "When I could not sleep. Figured the porch needed 2 chairs, if you were going to stay." Nettie kissed him. She did not plan it, did not think it through. She just stepped forward and put her hands on his chest and rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. He went still as a startled deer. For one terrible moment, she thought she had misread everything. Then his arms came around her and he pulled her close and kissed her back. Tentative at first, then deeper. Like a man remembering something he thought he had lost forever. That evening, he brought the new chair out to the porch. Set it beside the old one, close enough that someone sitting in them could reach out and hold hands without stretching. Nettie sat in the new chair. The wood was smooth beneath her palms. She rocked gently, and the runners moved easily without a single squeak. Josiah settled into the old chair beside her. He handed her the tin cup, the same one he had offered her on her very first day in Bitter Creek, steam rising from the coffee inside. "You kept it," she said, turning the cup in her hands. "Of course I kept it. That cup is special. It is the one I gave to the woman who saved my farm and my fool heart both." A meadowlark sang somewhere in the distance, the first bird Nettie had heard in weeks. The garden stretched out before them, silver in the fading light, heavy with the promise of harvest. Josiah reached into his pocket. He pulled out something small. A ring, simple silver, worn thin by years, polished smooth by time and touch. "It was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me before she passed, made me promise to give it to someone who deserved it, someone who would stay." He took Nettie's hand. "You said you were not pretty, and you were right about that. You are not pretty the way silk dresses and fancy hats are pretty, but you are real. You are honest. You are the kind of woman who digs for water with her bare hands and hauls buckets through the night and plants seeds in dead soil because you believe something good can grow there. That is worth more than pretty could ever be. I do not need fancy. I need honest. And you are the most honest person I have ever known." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was loose. She would need to wrap thread around it to keep it from slipping off. And that was fine. That was just right. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. Proper. In the church with a preacher and witnesses and whatever else needs doing." They sat together on the porch as the night deepened around them, rocking gently in their chairs, holding hands across the gap. The sky was enormous above them, thick with stars, and the wind carried the smell of ripe earth and cooling rain and something else, something that smelled like home. Nettie looked at the ring on her finger, at the man beside her, at the land they had fought to save. She thought about the day she had stepped off the stagecoach with her carpet bag and her 47 cents and her freckled face and told a stranger the honest truth about herself before he had even said hello. She thought about the tin cup of coffee he had given her in return. "I came here thinking I was not enough," she said quietly. "Not pretty enough. Not polished enough. Not worthy of much of anything. But you made me feel like exactly enough. Like who I am is exactly who I was supposed to be all along." Josiah squeezed her hand. "That is because it is," he said. "It always was." The meadowlark sang again. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and Nettie Groves, who had never in her life had a single thing she could call her own, rocked gently in a chair that had been built for her by a man who had learned to hope again. And she knew with a certainty as deep and quiet as the water running beneath the old oak tree that she was finally home. Some stories leave a quiet weight in the chest when they end. This one might be sitting there now. Something tender, something familiar, something that does not need a name to be understood. Many of us have stood where Nettie stood. Not on a dusty porch in Wyoming, perhaps, but in that place where we wondered if who we are could ever be enough. Some of us have loved someone who built walls around themselves, and we waited. Some of us have been the one doing the building. What matters is that you stayed until the end, that you sat with Nettie and Josiah through the dust and the rain and the long, hard nights. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.